The house was full that day. Laughter in the background, dishes clinking, conversations echoing. But inside me there was only a heavy silence. It was as if I were physically there, but my heart was far away, trapped between wounded pride and a deep sense of injustice. All my life I had tried to prove to my father that I was capable, that I deserved respect, affection, recognition. I never asked for too much. I never demanded luxury. I just wanted to feel that I had value in his eyes. But at that moment, everything became clear, painfully clear. He looked at me with that casual, almost indifferent expression and said with a crooked smile, "You don't need anything fancy," as if I were someone who didn't deserve anything grand, as if my effort, my choices, my journey, none of it mattered. That phrase fell on me like an invisible blow. I felt my chest tighten, my hands tremble. It wasn't just words. It was the confirmation of everything I feared. In his mind, I would always be small. I would always be the one who accepted the leftovers, while others received the best. For a few seconds, I was lost in confused thoughts. The pain came with an echo of the past. Years of listening to criticism, comparisons, jokes disguised as advice. I grew up trying to be enough, trying to deserve pride. And now there, in that simple sentence, everything seemed to have been thrown away as something unimportant. I took a deep breath and simply smiled. But it wasn't the smile of someone swallowing their pride. It was the smile of someone who had finally awakened. Something inside me had changed. If he thought I didn't need anything special, maybe it was time to show him that I didn't need his approval either. And that's when a silent decision took shape within me, a decision that would change everything, because what happened next would leave any family speechless. From childhood, my relationship with my father was never easy. He was the kind of man who believed that authority came before affection. That respect was earned through force, not example. I grew up hearing that the world was harsh, that only the strong survived, and that emotions were weakness. He was proud of this stance. He called it discipline, tradition, character. But behind it there was constant control, a silent demand that weighed more than any scolding. Nothing I did seemed enough. Did I get good grades? He asked why they weren't excellent. Did I achieve something important to me? He said that other people had already done it better earlier, with more difficulty. Every step I took was measured, compared, judged. And even so, I tried. I tried to be the ideal son he dreamed of. I adjusted. I kept quiet. I molded myself to fit his mold. I wanted to hear a simple, "I'm proud of you." But that phrase never came. The few times he showed any kind of approval, it was always tied to a condition. Keep it up. Don't get carried away. This doesn't mean anything yet. It was as if his affection was an unattainable prize, always a little beyond my reach. I remember watching other parents, kind and supportive, and wondering what it would be like to feel that way. At home, everything had to be strict, precise, with no room for error. He said he did it to prepare me for life, but deep down it seemed more like someone trying to mold a reflection of himself. And the more I tried to please him, the more I lost myself. Until that day, until that phrase that awakened something inside me. That's when I understood. No matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. And maybe the problem had never been with me, but with what he expected me to be. I remember it like it was yesterday. We were sitting at the table, the family gathered, talking about plans, about the future, about choices. It was one of those moments when I still held on to the small hope of hearing something positive from him. A word, a validating look, any gesture that showed that, in some way, I had value there. My cousin was excitedly talking about his plans, about investments, opportunities and dreams, and I, trying to participate in the conversation, mentioned something simple, just an idea of perhaps achieving something different for myself, something that represented a small step towards what I always wanted. Not luxury, but dignity, recognition, something that would say, "I deserve it too." That's when my father interrupted the conversation with that phrase, so casual, so light-hearted for him, but so devastating for me. "You don't need anything fancy." The words fell like blades. My cousin stopped talking. My mother sighed softly. Some looked away. Everyone felt the weight, but no one said anything. There, in front of everyone, he reduced my dreams, my efforts, and my self-esteem to nothing, as if I weren't worthy of the same as others, as if my life was meant to always be Plan B, the draft, enough only to survive, not to live well. I smiled, but inside I was crushed. It wasn't just about the comment. It was about years of being belittled, of always being reminded of my place, of my limits imposed by him. It was humiliation. It was veiled contempt. It was the confirmation of everything I tried to deny. In his opinion, I was never destined to have the best, only to accept the bare minimum. And I know many understand this feeling. What pain is it to be undervalued by those who should believe in you? How many times have we tried to be strong, to pretend it doesn't hurt, when in reality, all we wanted was to be seen, recognized, loved unconditionally? At that moment, I didn't answer. I just let the phrase echo inside me until it transformed into something more. Because that humiliation, instead of breaking me, awakened something I had never felt so clearly, the desire to no longer live under his expectations, to, for the first time, choose myself. Inheritance was always a sensitive subject in my family. My father treated it as a symbol of responsibility, almost as a test of who was worthy of continuing his legacy. He used to repeat that the money he left was the fruit of hard work, sacrifice, and discipline, and, in a way, I respected that. From an early age, I knew I would be entitled to a share, not an absurd fortune, but enough to start something important, to build a more comfortable future, to finally take an independent step, free from his shadow. I thought about using that money to invest in studies, projects, or even to buy something that symbolized my autonomy. But after that sentence, something inside me broke, and at the same time something new was born. I spent nights thinking, an inheritance isn't just money, it's meaning, it's recognition, it's continuity, and the more I reflected, the more I realized that accepting that amount, under the circumstances I was living in, would be like accepting the label he had always placed on me, someone who should be grateful for the bare minimum and never dare to want more. Then came the most painful dilemma of my life. I really needed that money, I won't lie. It would be useful, safe, sensible to keep it, but at the same time, there was a greater emotional weight, the need to show that my life wouldn't be guided by crumbs of approval, that I wouldn't cling to something just because he thought it was all I deserved. And that's when I made the unexpected decision, the one no one could have predicted. Without announcing it, without dramatizing it, without asking for opinions, I decided to donate my share of the inheritance to the only family member my father always despised, my cousin, the same one he constantly criticized, judged, and treated as an example of failure and irresponsibility. Not because my cousin was perfect, far from it, but because, unlike my father, he always treated me with respect, supported me, and listened to me. He believed in me when no one else did. When I signed the papers and finalized everything, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, my power of choice. And I knew that this decision would change everything, because when my father found out, the silence in the family would be deafening. My cousin was, for many, the black sheep of the family, not because he had done anything terrible, but because he never followed the path my father considered correct. While everyone expected him to fit the traditional mold, college, stable career, predictable life, he chose to forge a different path. He tried to start a business early, failed, started over, lost money, gained experience, and lived through the highs and lows that anyone with the courage to break the mold could experience. However, for my father, this was unforgivable. He said my cousin was irresponsible, immature, someone who didn't know how to value opportunities, and with that, he created a narrative that many within the family ended up repeating without truly reflecting on it. But I always saw something beyond that. I saw a young man struggling to find his place, who didn't have the same emotional support that I also sought and didn't find, someone who, despite the lack of recognition, never stopped trying. And it was precisely this silent determination, this stubbornness to continue, that always inspired me. He wasn't perfect. He had flaws. He made mistakes. But who doesn't? The difference is that, while I struggled to earn crumbs of approval, he chose to be free from expectations, even paying a high price for it. The truth is that my father's hatred for him was never really personal. It was ideological. My cousin represented everything my father despised: autonomy, audacity, the audacity to fail while trying, and perhaps also the fear that that wrong path would one day prove to be right. The family was divided between those who saw potential in him and those who saw failure. Me? I always saw a steadfast heart, someone loyal, someone who, even when excluded, never stopped lending a hand when I needed it. When I decided to give him my share of the inheritance, it wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was an act of justice, a silent acknowledgement of everything he tried, everything he faced without support. It was like saying, "You deserve a real chance, not because the world approved of you, but because you never stopped fighting." Perhaps to some this seems crazy, but for me it was a way of freeing two people at the same time. Him from an unfair label and me from a life of silence and submission. And in that gesture, I found something my father never understood. Redemption isn't about who wins, but about who decides to be true to themselves. When I made the decision to leave my inheritance to my cousin, many people might think it was an impulsive act, driven by anger or revenge. But in fact, it was the opposite. I didn't want to punish my father, nor prove anything to him. It wasn't about causing pain, it was about finally healing my own. For years I lived waiting for him to see me, to recognize who I was, the effort I made, the value I had, and each failed attempt trapped me further in this feeling of always being in the shadows, always small, always invisible, until I realized something simple but liberating. I didn't need his validation to be whole. That gesture was my way of saying, first to myself and then to the world, that my life would not be guided by his expectations, that I would no longer accept emotional crumbs, that I had the right to desire more, to achieve more, to dream without asking permission. Signing that document felt like an old chain had broken, the chain of fear of disappointing, of fear of not being enough, of fear of existing outside his gaze. It was then that I understood. It wasn't revenge, it was freedom. I'm tired of living in his shadow, of trying to be who he thought I should be, of stifling my own dreams to fit into a tight box, shaped by his frustrations and pride. And so many go through this, growing up believing that love needs to be earned, that affection needs to be conquered, that respect is a privilege and not a right. Growing up hearing that feeling is weakness, that wanting is pretension, that existing authentically is rebellion. But on that day I decided to break the cycle. I chose my worth above tradition. I chose my essence above approval. I chose courage instead of silence. And for the first time, I felt a strength that didn't come from trying to please someone, but from finally pleasing myself. Freeing yourself from someone isn't about hating them, it's about finding yourself. And that's exactly what happened. I found myself, and no one will ever put me in that shadow again. When my father found out what I had done, silence was his first reaction, and perhaps the most brutal of all. There was no immediate explosion, no shouting, no instant accusations. He just looked at me, and in that look there was disbelief, confusion, and something I had rarely seen from him. Vulnerability masked by wounded pride. It was as if for the first time he realized he no longer had control over my decisions, as if the script he had imagined for my life had been torn up before his eyes, without warning. But the silence didn't last long. Soon came the anger, a cold, calculated anger, typical of him. He didn't yell. He never needed to do that to make someone feel small. He spoke slowly, measuring each word like blades, trying to make me reconsider, trying to remind me of where I came from, of how much he had done for me. He spoke of ingratitude, of disrespect, of family tradition. It was almost comical. He wasn't upset about the money itself, but about the loss of control, the breaking of the cycle he believed to be eternal. The family was divided. Some silently sided with me, because confronting my father had never been easy. Others, out of fear or convenience, whispered that I had overreacted, that I should have been smarter, as if emotional freedom were recklessness. My mother cried, not because of the money, but because she knew something deep had broken there. She had always tried to be a bridge, but that day she realized there were no more bridges to rebuild without me sacrificing myself again. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Harsh stares, swallowed words, silent judgments. My father tried to argue until the end, attempting to make my gesture seem childish, impulsive, but I remained firm. For the first time, I didn't lower my head. I didn't apologize for existing differently from what he wanted. I didn't try to explain my worth. And then came the final moment. He simply turned his face away and left, as if denying my presence was his last weapon. But something had changed, and not in me. It changed in him. For the first time he saw that I could choose a life where I didn't need him as a reference point, and that, for him, was the greatest confrontation of all. The house was filled with silence, but inside me there was peace, dramatic, tense, painful, but real. I had lost his approval, perhaps forever, but finally I had gained my own. The days that followed the decision were intense, but surprisingly liberating. For the first time, I woke up without that heavy feeling in my chest, without the need to prove anything to anyone. There was no longer the constant echo of my father's expectations guiding my steps, nor the shadow of his judgment hanging over my every choice. It was like breathing fresh air after years in a suffocating environment. Over time, I realized that the world wouldn't crumble because I chose myself. On the contrary, it was finally beginning to open up before me. My cousin, upon hearing the decision, was speechless. He hadn't expected something of that magnitude, not even remotely. I saw in his eyes a mixture of surprise, shock, and above all, genuine gratitude. He hugged me tightly, one of those hugs that carry history, pain, and hope all at once. It wasn't about money. It was about being seen, being valued, someone finally saying, "You deserve a chance." He promised to honor that, not as a burden, but as an impetus to rebuild his path with dignity. And in that instant, I knew I had made the right choice. Not out of rebellion, but out of recognizing the value of someone who, despite everything, never gave up. And what about me? I found something precious. Peace. Not a silent, empty peace, but a living peace that is born when you embrace who you are. I began to see my own plans more clearly, not with fear of failure, but with a real desire to build, step by step, something that reflected my values and my dreams, not someone else's. Maturity came as a natural reflection, understanding that growing up isn't about gaining approval, it's about gaining emotional autonomy. It's about being able to look back and not feel regret for having followed a different path, but pride for having chosen the right path for me. This decision transformed me. I didn't become bitter nor someone who lives in conflict with the past. On the contrary, I became whole, someone who no longer needs external applause to feel worthy. And while many still try to understand or judge, I move forward, serene, firm, and grateful for finally having learned something that took years to blossom within me. Life only makes sense when we have the courage to live it truthfully. In the end, the biggest lesson wasn't about money, family, or possessions. It was about value. Because the truth is simple and brutal. No amount of money can heal emotional wounds left by years of indifference, silence, and devaluation. The inheritance could have made my life easier, of course. It could have paved the way, accelerated my achievements. But it would never erase the pain of being seen as someone who deserves less, someone who should accept crumbs and be grateful. Money buys comfort, but it doesn't buy dignity. And dignity once earned is worth more than any check or property. For a long time, I confused approval with love. I thought that if I worked harder, if I proved myself more, if I kept quiet more, one day I would be enough for him. But life taught me that no one can give you the value that you deny yourself. The validation we so desperately seek from others is often the same validation we need to learn to give ourselves first. When I understood this, everything changed. Choosing my worth over the desire to be accepted wasn't arrogance. It was liberation. It was the first step towards a life where I walked with my head held high, not because I achieved much, but because I stopped diminishing myself. In the end, I realized that respect is more valuable than any inheritance. I can earn money by working, studying, creating new opportunities, but respect, that can't be bought, it's earned. And I'm not just talking about the respect of others. I'm talking about self-respect, the kind of respect that allows you to look in the mirror and not see someone who sold themselves for acceptance, but someone who chose their own voice even when it trembled. And perhaps that is the greatest wealth of all, knowing that you have the courage to choose your own story, even if it challenges traditions, expectations, and standards. Because in the end, what matters is not what was left for you, it's what you decide to carry with you from now on. And I chose to carry freedom, peace, and the certainty that no one defines my worth but myself. At the end of this journey, a truth remains that not everyone is ready to face. Freedom is not achieved by following what is expected of us, but by finally choosing who we are, even if it costs us opinions, ties, or paths already laid out by others. Some people spend their entire lives chasing approval, dreaming of hearing words that never come, hoping that recognition will come as a reward for silence, obedience, and self-sacrifice. But true victory happens when you understand that you don't need applause to live your truth. Because sometimes the greatest luxury is emotional freedom, the ability to breathe without weight, to live without fear, to be yourself without asking permission. My decision may have seemed extreme to some, to others, inspiring. Perhaps some see rebellion, perhaps some see courage. But above all, what exists here is authenticity. I chose to free myself. I chose my peace. I chose my worth. And that choice transformed everything. I didn't receive applause. I didn't get medals. But I gained something much more precious, the chance to rewrite my story without carrying the shadow of someone who never saw me completely. That is priceless, and never will be. Now, I want to know from you, and you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have saved the money and remained trapped by expectations? Or would you have had the courage to break with everything and finally put yourself first? Think about it. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that truly set us free. If this story touched you, made you reflect, awakened something within you, then I ask you for a simple but powerful gesture. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and share your opinion. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And together, our stories build a space where no one needs to give up on themselves to be accepted. Let's continue this conversation, because maybe like me, you too are ready to choose your own freedom.